Pam Hupp. On August 16, 2016, Louis Gumpenberger was driven to the home by Pam Hupp, who had lured him into her SUV at his apartment complex by posing as a producer, needing help to reenact a 911 call. The 33-year-old man, who lived with disabilities after a traumatic brain injury years earlier, had been promised quick money. Instead, he walked into a trap that would end his life and expose one of Missouri's most manipulative criminals. Pamela Marie Hupp shot Gumpenberger 5 times in her home, then called police claiming self-defense against an intruder. But investigators quickly found problems with her story. The scene had been staged with planted evidence, including cash and a knife, along with a note in Gumpenberger's pocket implicating Russ Faria, a man previously convicted in another case connected to Hupp. What drove this seemingly ordinary woman to such calculated deception? The plot unraveled through cell phone records placing Hupp near Gumpenberger's residence before the incident, witness accounts of her posing as a Dateline NBC producer, and the 9 $100 bills found on Gumpenberger had serial numbers that were in sequential order and directly matched a $1,000 withdrawal Hupp had made from her bank earlier that same day. The evidence painted a picture of meticulous planning designed to frame another person while covering her tracks in an earlier homicide. Hupp's criminal history extended beyond Gumpenberger. On December 27, 2011, Betsy Faria had been stabbed over 55 times in Troy, Missouri. Hupp, who had driven Faria home that evening, became the last known person to see her alive. The investigation revealed that Hupp had become beneficiary of Faria's $150,000 life insurance policy just days before the homicide. Despite mounting suspicions, the original investigation focused on Betsy's husband, Russ, who was wrongfully convicted and spent years in prison before his exoneration. The case against him crumbled when examined more closely, with prosecutor Mike Wood later calling the original investigation mismanaged due to bias. How did investigators miss the obvious suspect for so long? Inconsistencies in Hupp's statements, cell phone location data contradicting her timeline, and her insistence on driving Betsy home that fateful night all pointed toward her involvement. Yet the initial investigation overlooked these red flags, allowing Hupp to collect the insurance money and evade justice for years. A third suspicious incident involved Hupp's mother, Shirley Newman, who died from a balcony fall in 2013. While officially ruled undetermined, high levels of zolpidem were found in her system, and Hupp was the sole beneficiary of her estate. No charges were filed, though the circumstances raised additional questions about a pattern of deaths surrounding Hupp. When confronted with overwhelming evidence in the Gumpenberger case, Hupp entered an Alford plea in June 2019, avoiding a death penalty trial while maintaining she wasn't admitting guilt. The plea came after her December 2016 indictment and lengthy legal proceedings where prosecutors had sought capital punishment. During jail calls played in court, Hupp dismissed victims as seeking 15 minutes of fame, showing no remorse for the lives destroyed by her actions. In a call to her husband after the plea, she stated, "I pleaded guilty so my family wouldn't witness an ugly trial," framing her decision as protecting loved ones rather than accepting responsibility. Hupp received life in prison without parole in August 2019 and was sent to Chillicothe Correctional Center. But her legal saga wasn't finished. In July 2021, prosecutors finally charged her with Betsy Faria's homicide, a case that had haunted investigators for a decade. While the trial is tentatively scheduled for August 2026, prosecutors originally announced they would seek the death penalty in July 2021 when Hupp was first charged with the murder of Betsy Faria. Even from prison, Hupp continues fighting legal battles. She's currently contesting efforts to garnish her prison wages for a $3 million wrongful death lawsuit filed by Gumpenberger's mother. The case exemplifies how financial motives drove her actions, with money appearing to be a game she played without regard for human consequences, from calculated deception by an adult to something far more disturbing from someone barely old enough to drive. Alyssa Bustamante. On October 21, 2009, a young girl went missing in St. Martins, Missouri, sparking an immediate search by concerned neighbors and authorities. The 9-year-old had been playing near her home when she vanished, leaving her family frantic with worry as darkness fell and temperatures dropped. On October 23rd, authorities made the discovery only after Bustamante led them to the site. The grave was so well camouflaged with brush and leaves that search teams had walked past it multiple times without seeing it. She had been strangled, her throat cut, and stabbed 8 times in the chest. The brutality of the attack shocked the small Missouri community and raised immediate questions about who could commit such violence. The answer came from an unexpected source: 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante, Elizabeth's neighbor. During police questioning, Bustamante confessed to luring the younger girl into the woods, carrying out the attack, and burying her body in a grave she had dug beforehand. The premeditation was evident in the prepared burial site, showing this was no impulsive act. What could drive a teenager to such calculated violence? The chilling answer emerged when investigators examined Bustamante's diary. In an entry dated the day of the homicide, she had written, "I just killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel ATM. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the 'oh my God, I can't do this' feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kinda nervous and shaky though right now. Okay, I gotta go to church now. Lol." The casual tone and disturbing enthusiasm in the diary entry revealed a troubling motivation: curiosity. Bustamante later told authorities she wanted to know what it felt like to end someone's life, treating the act as an experiment rather than recognizing the human cost. Background investigation revealed Bustamante had struggled with mental health challenges. She had been diagnosed with depression and borderline personality disorder, conditions that had led to previous concerning behavior. But mental health issues, while providing context, didn't excuse the premeditated nature of her actions. Her upbringing had been unstable. Bustamante's parents struggled with substance issues and legal problems, leaving her in the care of her grandparents. This disrupted childhood may have contributed to her psychological state, though many people face similar circumstances without turning to violence. How did the legal system handle prosecuting someone so young for such a serious crime? Despite her age, Bustamante was indicted as an adult in November 2009, reflecting the severity of the premeditated homicide. Her case became a focal point for debates about juvenile justice, brain development in teenagers, and appropriate sentencing for young offenders who commit violent acts. Initially charged with first-degree homicide and armed criminal action, Bustamante eventually reached a plea agreement in January 2012. She pleaded guilty to second-degree homicide and armed criminal action, avoiding a trial that would have forced Elizabeth's family to endure detailed testimony about her final moments. In February 2012, Bustamante received a life sentence with the possibility of parole, plus 30 consecutive years for the armed criminal action charge. The sentence acknowledged both the seriousness of her crime and her age at the time, leaving open the theoretical possibility of eventual release while ensuring decades of incarceration. Elizabeth's family provided victim impact statements describing the devastating loss of a vibrant young girl whose life was cut short by senseless violence. Their grief stood in stark contrast to Bustamante's diary entry describing the act as enjoyable, highlighting the profound disconnect between perpetrator and victim. Bustamante was sent to Chillicothe Correctional Center, where she remains incarcerated. Her first parole hearing occurred in July 2024, more than a decade after her sentencing. The board denied parole, with her next hearing scheduled for 2029. Under her sentence structure, Her earliest possible release date would be 2059, when she would be 65 years old. While 2059 is the expiration of her full sentence, Missouri's 2021 Second Chance Act for juveniles allows her to remain eligible for parole hearings every 5 years, meaning her actual release could occur much earlier if granted by the board. While one teenager acted alone for twisted curiosity, the next case involved a mother and daughter working together with equally disturbing motives. Diane Stout and Rachel Stout. In Springfield, Missouri, a series of mysterious illnesses and deaths struck the Stout family beginning in 2012. Mark Stout died in April 2012 after experiencing severe symptoms that doctors initially attributed to natural causes. Just months later, in September 2012, his son Sean succumbed to similar mysterious symptoms, again initially explained as medical complications. When daughter Sarah fell critically ill in June 2013, displaying the same pattern of symptoms that had claimed her father and brother, medical professionals began to suspect something more sinister than coincidence. Sarah survived, but suffered permanent organ damage, including kidney failure that would affect her for the rest of her life. What authorities eventually uncovered shocked the community: a mother-daughter team systematically poisoning family members with antifreeze. Diane Stout and her daughter Rachel had been adding ethylene glycol to their victims' drinks, causing agonizing deaths that they watched unfold with apparent indifference. The investigation broke open when Pastor Jeff Sippy of the Redeemer Lutheran Church contacted the Springfield Police Department directly to report his suspicions about the family's string of medical tragedies. This prompted investigators to review the cases with fresh eyes, looking for connections between the similar symptoms and sudden deaths. Toxicology analysis confirmed the presence of antifreeze in the victims' systems. Further investigation revealed Rachel's diary entries that chillingly documented the plot. She had written, "My father will pass on in the next 2 months. Sean will move on shortly after," demonstrating clear premeditation and knowledge of the timeline for the poisonings. Why would a mother and daughter conspire to eliminate their own family? The motives revealed during the investigation were shockingly banal. In her confession, Diane stated she poisoned Mark because she hated his guts and he was a burden, and she poisoned Sean because he was worse than a pest, and she was tired of caring for him. Sean, who had autism, was viewed as a pest whose care demands were unwanted. Sarah's requests for financial help had become burdensome to Diane, who saw her children as obstacles rather than family. Rachel, who appeared to be Diane's favored offspring, went along with her mother's deadly plan. Her diary entries showed cold calculation, predicting deaths months in advance and documenting the progress of the poisoning scheme as if it were an ordinary task list. The method was insidious. They added antifreeze to drinks their victims consumed regularly. Mark's Gatorade, Sean's soda, Sarah's beverages. The sweet taste of ethylene glycol made it difficult to detect, especially when mixed with flavored drinks. The victims suffered terribly as the poison destroyed their organs, a process Diane and Rachel observed without seeking help or showing remorse. Confronted with evidence, both eventually confessed. Rachel provided details of her involvement, including how she assisted in administering the poison and maintaining the deception afterward. Diane initially confessed but later recanted, attempting to claim innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Rachel pleaded guilty in May 2015 to 2 counts of second-degree homicide and 1 count of assault, and was sentenced in March 2016 to 2 life terms plus 20 years, accepting responsibility for her role in the deaths of her father and brother and the near-fatal poisoning of her sister. Her plea came first, and she cooperated with prosecutors building the case against her mother. Diane was sentenced to life without parole in February 2016. At sentencing, she claimed Rachel acted alone and that she was unaware of the poisonings, contradicting her earlier confession and the evidence presented. Both received life sentences. Rachel became eligible for parole consideration after 42.5 years, reflecting her cooperation and younger age. Diane received life without parole, ensuring she will never leave prison. They are incarcerated at separate facilities, Rachel at Vandalia Correctional Center and Diane at Chillicothe. Sarah, the surviving victim, faced the difficult path of recovery with permanent health damage. In victim impact statements, she expressed a complex mixture of emotions. "I forgive my mom, but she took away my dad, brother, lifestyle." Her physical recovery continues, but the psychological impact of knowing her own mother tried to end her life remains, from family poisoning to a staged home invasion with financial motives. Viola Bowman. On July 21, 2018, emergency responders rushed to a Liberty, Missouri home after receiving a 911 call reporting a burglary and shooting. The caller, Viola Bowman, claimed intruders had broken into her residence and shot her husband, Rex Bowman, during the incident. First responders arrived to find Rex deceased from gunshot wounds. The scene appeared to show signs of forced entry and a struggle, supporting Viola's account of a home invasion. But as investigators examined the evidence more closely, inconsistencies began to emerge that cast doubt on the grieving widow's story. At the time of the shooting in 2018, the couple had been married for 34 years, and while there were no public legal troubles, trial testimony later revealed a strained relationship and financial disagreements prior to the incident. Rex worked in insurance, and they lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where violent crime was rare. On the surface, they seemed an unlikely couple for such a tragedy. What investigators discovered told a different story entirely. The crime scene staging became apparent through forensic analysis. The supposed forced entry didn't match typical burglary patterns, and valuable items remained untouched throughout the home. The positioning of Rex's body and the gunshot trajectories contradicted Viola's version of events. Financial investigation revealed a powerful motive. Rex had a substantial life insurance policy, and Viola stood to collect a significant payout upon his death. The timing of the shooting, combined with the staged burglary, suggested a plan to make his death appear random rather than targeted. Viola's own statements to investigators contained contradictions that raised red flags. Her timeline didn't align with physical evidence, and details she provided about the supposed intruders changed between interviews. The 911 call audio was analyzed for authenticity, revealing patterns inconsistent with genuine distress. Most damaging were statements Viola made while in custody, believing she wasn't being monitored. Jail recordings captured her discussing elements of the crime that contradicted her official account, providing prosecutors with direct evidence of her guilt. Prosecutors charged Viola with first-degree homicide and armed criminal action. They presented her with a plea offer that would have avoided a life sentence, but Viola rejected the plea deal, choosing instead to take her case to trial. This decision would prove costly. During the trial, prosecutors methodically dismantled Viola's home invasion narrative. They presented forensic evidence showing the scene was staged, financial records establishing motive, and recordings of Viola's contradictory statements. Expert witnesses testified about the impossibility of her version of events based on physical evidence. Prosecutors established that Viola stood to collect over $450,000 in life insurance proceeds, and that she had specifically inquired about the payout shortly after Rex's death. Character witnesses described the marriage as strained, contradicting Viola's portrayal of a happy relationship interrupted by random violence. In June 2021, a jury found Viola Bowman guilty of second-degree murder and armed criminal action. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional time for the armed criminal action charge. The sentence reflected both the premeditated nature of the homicide and the attempt to deceive investigators through staging. Viola filed appeals challenging her conviction, arguing various legal grounds, including evidence admissibility and trial procedures. The Missouri Court of Appeals affirmed her conviction and sentence, finding no reversible errors in the trial court's handling of the case. While Viola acted alone in a carefully staged crime, the next case involved an accomplice in a robbery that turned deadly. Onyai Turner. On October 8, 2018, tragedy struck a Maryland Heights, Missouri home when intruders broke in targeting a family. The incident resulted in the deaths of a father and his young son, shocking a community where such violence was uncommon. Onyai Turner carried out the home invasion alongside two accomplices, Travion Bolden and Kavion Dyson, who were also charged in connection with the deaths of Edward Hill Jr. and his son. The planning and execution of the crime showed deliberate intent rather than a spontaneous act of violence. The victims were attacked in their own home, a violation of the sanctuary families expect in their residences. While the victims suffered a brutal attack, investigators determined the causes of death for the 45-year-old father and his 4-year-old son were gunshot wounds sustained during the targeted robbery. The brutality of the attack reflected rage beyond what simple robbery would explain. What drove this young woman to participate in such violence? Investigation revealed complex motives mixing financial gain with personal animosity. The robbery aspect suggested material motives, but the level of violence indicated deeper hostility toward the victims. Turner's involvement wasn't passive. She actively participated in the planning and execution of the attack. After the homicides, Turner and her accomplice attempted to continue with normal activities. Witness accounts placed them at a restaurant shortly after the crimes, eating a meal as if nothing had happened. This disturbing disconnect between the gravity of their actions and their subsequent behavior demonstrated a troubling lack of remorse or recognition of what they had done. Law enforcement investigation moved quickly, identifying Turner and her accomplice through evidence at the scene and witness statements. The pair's movements before and after the crimes were traced through surveillance footage, cell phone records, and witness interviews that built a timeline of the events. Turner was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide, armed criminal action, and related charges. The prosecution sought severe penalties given the calculated nature of the home invasion and the particularly vulnerable victims who were attacked in their own residence. The case against Turner included physical evidence linking her to the scene, testimony from witnesses who observed her before and after the crimes, and statements she made during interrogation. The strength of the evidence made conviction likely, though Turner initially pleaded not guilty. Eventually, Turner changed her plea, accepting guilt in exchange for a specific sentence recommendation. The plea agreement spared the victim's family from enduring a lengthy trial where details of their loved one's final moments would be extensively discussed. In June 2024, Onyai Turner was sentenced to 2 consecutive 30-year terms for the murders, plus an additional 20 years for other charges. The consecutive nature of the sentences meant that even if one were overturned on appeal, the others would keep her incarcerated. She is currently serving her sentence in a Missouri correctional facility. From a robbery turned violent to a case involving the most vulnerable victim imaginable. Amber Waterman. In October 2022, a pregnant woman disappeared in Arkansas, sparking immediate concern from family and law enforcement. The victim, Ashley Bush, was 31 years old and 31 weeks pregnant when she disappeared after being lured by a fake job offer posted under the name Lucy on Facebook. An intensive search began as investigators traced her last known movements. The investigation led to Missouri, where authorities discovered the victim's body. She had been killed, and her unborn baby had been removed. The horrific nature of the crime shocked even experienced investigators, representing one of the most disturbing cases in recent Missouri criminal history. Amber Waterman, a Pineville, Missouri woman, was identified as the perpetrator. Evidence showed she had lured the victim with promises of employment, using this deception to get the pregnant woman alone where she could be attacked. The premeditation was evident in the planning required for such a scheme. The motive was as disturbing as the crime itself. Waterman wanted to claim the victim's baby as her own, apparently faking a pregnancy to her acquaintances and needing an actual infant to maintain the deception. This desire drove her to commit kidnapping and homicide, treating the victim as merely a means to obtain a child. How did investigators identify Waterman as the perpetrator? The trail of evidence included communications between Waterman and the victim regarding the supposed job opportunity, surveillance footage placing them together, and physical evidence at multiple locations. Federal prosecutors built a case tracking Waterman's movements and establishing the kidnapping crossed state lines, giving federal jurisdiction. Forensic evidence showed the victim suffered significant trauma. The removal of the baby demonstrated a level of desperation and disregard for human life that particularly appalled prosecutors and the public. Medical examiners determined the victim was alive when the attack began, adding to the horror of her final moments. Tragically, the unborn baby did not survive. The infant's body was found separately from the mother's after Amber Waterman claimed to have given birth in the back of a truck. Waterman was arrested and charged in both state and federal court. Federal charges included kidnapping resulting in death, a capital offense. State charges in Arkansas and Missouri added to the legal cases against her. Before trial, questions arose about Waterman's mental competency to stand trial. Psychological evaluations were ordered to determine if she understood the proceedings and could assist in her defense. These evaluations ultimately found her competent, allowing prosecution to proceed. In federal court, Waterman pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, accepting consecutive life sentences instead. This plea came after extensive negotiations between defense and prosecution, with the victim's family consulted about the resolution. The federal sentencing hearing featured devastating victim impact statements from the woman's family, describing a beloved daughter, sister, and soon-to-be mother whose life was stolen. They spoke of the trauma of losing both their family member and nearly losing the baby who survived. In June 2024, Amber Waterman was sentenced to 1 life term in federal prison without the possibility of parole for kidnapping resulting in death and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. State charges in Arkansas remain pending, with trials scheduled for 2026. These charges could result in additional sentences, though the federal life terms already ensure Waterman will die in custody. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. From a case involving the most vulnerable victim imaginable to one driven by a dispute over stolen property. Caitlin Riffle. On November 11, 2017, a confrontation over a firearm in Kansas City, Missouri, turned deadly when Caitlin Riffle and her boyfriend went to an apartment on Tracy Avenue to retrieve a handgun from Rodney Thurber. The dispute centered on a weapon that had allegedly been taken, setting in motion events that would end in homicide and life sentences for those involved. Caitlin Riffle arrived at the scene with her boyfriend, who confronted the victim about the missing firearm. The situation quickly spiraled into violence when shots were fired, killing the victim in what prosecutors would argue was a planned execution rather than a spontaneous conflict. Riffle's role went beyond mere presence at the scene. Evidence showed she had been holding the disputed firearm and had actively participated in the planning that led to the deadly encounter. Her involvement demonstrated clear intent rather than passive observation of events unfolding around her. What circumstances led to such a violent resolution over property? The investigation revealed a history of disputes between the parties involved, with the stolen firearm representing a breaking point in deteriorating relationships. Rather than pursuing legal remedies to recover the weapon, those involved chose confrontation, with fatal consequences. Witness statements and physical evidence at the scene contradicted initial claims of self-defense or accidental discharge. The positioning of the victim, ballistic evidence, and timeline of events all pointed toward a deliberate attack rather than a defensive response to threat. Surveillance footage from nearby locations helped investigators piece together the movements of all parties before and after the incident. This video evidence placed Riffle and her boyfriend at the scene during the critical time frame and tracked their departure afterward. Both Riffle and her boyfriend were arrested and charged with first-degree homicide and armed criminal action. The prosecution built a case showing their joint participation in planning and executing the attack, with each playing distinct but coordinated roles. During legal proceedings, the strength of evidence against both defendants became apparent. The combination of witness testimony, physical evidence, and surveillance footage created a compelling case that would be difficult to overcome at trial. Riffle was convicted by a Jackson County jury in April 2021 of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. Riffle received a life sentence plus 15 additional years for her role in the homicide. The additional time reflected the armed criminal action charge, with the sentences structured to ensure decades of incarceration, even if one charge were later overturned. Her boyfriend, Patrick Powell, was sentenced to life without parole plus 10 years for his role as the shooter. Riffle remains incarcerated in Missouri, with her earliest possible release date decades away. The life sentence ensures she will spend the majority, if not all, of her remaining years behind bars for a decision made in moments that destroyed multiple lives. While one case involved adults choosing violence, the next features someone whose path to prison began during adolescence. Jessica Hicklin. On September 24, 1995, a confrontation during a drug transaction in Cass County, Missouri, ended in the fatal shooting of Sean Smith. The incident occurred when Jessica Hicklin, then 16 years old, shot Sean Smith 3 times following a dispute involving a controlled stimulant transaction. The victim was shot during the encounter, succumbing to injuries at the scene. Hicklin was arrested and charged with first-degree homicide, facing prosecution as an adult, despite being just below the age of legal majority. The severity of the charges reflected both the fatal outcome and prosecutors' determination that the crime showed adult-level planning. Background investigation revealed Hicklin had experienced a turbulent upbringing marked by instability and early exposure to substance use. These circumstances, while providing context for her path to criminal involvement, didn't excuse the choice to participate in a robbery that led to someone's death. During this period, Hicklin was also struggling with gender dysphoria, a condition that would become more significant during her lengthy incarceration. At the time of the crime, she presented as male but internally grappled with gender identity questions that complicated an already difficult adolescence. What factors contributed to a teenager making such a destructive choice? The combination of substance involvement, difficult home environment, and untreated mental health challenges created circumstances where poor decisions had catastrophic consequences. Investigators found evidence suggesting methamphetamine use may have influenced Hicklin's judgment and contributed to paranoia that escalated the robbery situation. The case proceeded to trial, where prosecutors presented evidence of premeditation and intent to commit robbery, with the homicide occurring during the commission of that felony. Under Missouri law, deaths occurring during certain felonies can result in first-degree charges regardless of whether the fatality was the primary intent. Hicklin was convicted and received a life sentence, joining hundreds of other juveniles nationwide serving adult sentences for serious violent crimes. The sentence reflected standards of the time, before subsequent Supreme Court rulings would reshape juvenile sentencing laws. During her incarceration, Hicklin began the process of gender transition, identifying as transgender and seeking appropriate medical care. This led to a landmark legal case challenging Missouri Department of Corrections policies regarding health care for transgender inmates. Hicklin versus Precythe became a significant case in establishing rights for transgender inmates, with Hicklin advocating for access to hormone therapy and other gender-affirming medical care. The litigation drew attention to conditions transgender individuals face in correctional settings and helped establish legal precedents for their treatment. The case succeeded in changing Missouri prison policies, benefiting not just Hicklin, but other transgender inmates in the state system. This advocacy work from within prison walls represented a form of redemption and purpose beyond serving time for her crime. How did juvenile sentencing reforms affect Hicklin's case? Following Supreme Court decisions in cases like Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana, which addressed juvenile life sentences, many states, including Missouri, reviewed cases involving offenders who were under 18 at the time of their crimes. These rulings recognized developmental differences between juveniles and adults and required consideration of age as a mitigating factor. Under revised standards, Hicklin became eligible for parole consideration rather than facing mandatory life without the possibility of release. The change acknowledged both her age at the time of the crime and her behavior during nearly 2 decades of incarceration. Her parole application highlighted her advocacy work, participation in educational programs, and demonstrated personal growth during imprisonment. The board considered factors including her youth at the time of offense, the circumstances that led to her involvement, and evidence of rehabilitation. In January 2022, after serving 26 years, Hicklin was released from the Potosi Correctional Center on parole. Her release represented one of the outcomes intended by reformed juvenile sentencing laws, allowing for second chances when inmates demonstrate genuine change and rehabilitation potential. She now lives in St. Louis, working to rebuild a life after spending her entire adult development in prison. The transition from decades of incarceration to freedom presents enormous challenges, requiring adaptation to a world dramatically different from the one she left as a teenager. From a case shaped by youth to one driven by adult desperation and psychological crisis. Victoria Lee Isaac. On April 21, 2013, emergency responders arrived at a Puxico, Missouri residence to find a devastating scene. Victoria Lee Isaac's husband lay deceased, having suffered multiple gunshot wounds while he slept. The attack's brutality shocked the small rural community where such violence was rare. Isaac initially told investigators that she had woken up to find her husband dead and claimed she did not know who had shot him, before later shifting to a defense based on her mental state. However, physical evidence told a clear story of 11 shots fired into her sleeping husband's head, demonstrating sustained intent rather than a momentary impulse or accident. The crime scene investigation revealed no signs of forced entry or third-party involvement. All evidence pointed to Isaac as the sole person present during the attack, with no credible alternative explanation for her husband's death. What could drive someone to commit such violence against a sleeping spouse? Isaac's defense centered on mental health claims, arguing she experienced psychological episodes that impaired her judgment and control. She described feeling compelled by internal forces she characterized as something that urged her to act, suggesting diminished capacity at the time of the homicide. Prosecutors countered that the methodical nature of the attack, firing 11 separate shots, demonstrated consciousness and sustained intent incompatible with complete loss of control. They argued that mental health challenges, while potentially relevant to mitigation, didn't negate criminal responsibility for deliberately ending another person's life. Psychiatric evaluations were conducted to assess Isaac's mental state both at the time of the crime and during legal proceedings. These evaluations explored her psychological history, any diagnosed conditions, and whether those conditions affected her ability to understand the wrongfulness of her actions. The question of whether someone can be held fully accountable for actions allegedly driven by mental illness became central to the case. Missouri law requires that defendants understand the nature and quality of their actions and appreciate that those actions were wrong. Standards that shape outcomes in cases involving mental health defenses. Isaac was charged with second-degree homicide rather than first-degree, suggesting prosecutors determined they couldn't prove the highest level of premeditation required for capital charges. Second-degree reflects intentional killing without the deliberation element of first-degree charges. The case proceeded through the legal system, with Isaac maintaining that her mental state rendered her not fully culpable for her actions. Her defense team presented expert testimony about psychological conditions and their potential effects on behavior and judgment. Despite mental health arguments, the court found Isaac guilty of second-degree homicide and related charges in November 2016. At sentencing, the judge considered both the severity of the crime and arguments about Isaac's mental state. She received a life sentence plus 25 additional years, ensuring decades of incarceration regardless of potential future parole eligibility. She remains incarcerated in Missouri's correctional system, with mental health services available through the Department of Corrections. Whether those services adequately address her needs while ensuring public safety continues to be a consideration in her incarceration. From complicated questions of mental health to a case of fatal mistreatment. Angela West. In March 2023, authorities in Waynesville, Missouri responded to a tragic incident involving the death of a young girl. The investigation revealed circumstances that shocked the community and led to serious criminal charges against Angela West. The victim had suffered severe mistreatment before succumbing to injuries that medical examiners determined were inconsistent with natural causes or accidents. Physical evidence showed a pattern of harm over time rather than a single incident. West was identified as the primary caregiver responsible for the young girl's well-being. Investigation into the household revealed conditions and treatment patterns that constituted serious endangerment, with fatal consequences that transformed what might have been endangerment charges into homicide prosecution. Medical examiners found the young victim had a sock stuffed in her mouth, secured by a bandana or tape, and was found with extensive ligature marks on her wrists, ankles, and neck, indicating she had been tied to a futon. Additional evidence showed the victim had been subjected to ongoing mistreatment in the form of discipline methods that crossed from acceptable parenting into criminal territory. How did such a situation develop without intervention? Investigations into family dynamics revealed isolation that kept the household's internal conditions hidden from those who might have reported concerns. The victim attended no school where teachers might notice signs of distress or physical marks, and limited outside contact meant few opportunities for the situation to come to light. West claimed her treatment of the young girl constituted legitimate discipline for behavioral issues. However, the nature and severity of the methods used, combined with the fatal outcome, led prosecutors to reject characterizations of appropriate parenting and instead pursue serious criminal charges. Charges included child endangerment resulting in death, reflecting legal standards that hold caregivers accountable when their treatment of dependents creates substantial risk and leads to fatal outcomes. Missouri law treats such cases seriously, with penalties reflecting society's commitment to protecting vulnerable individuals. Both Angela West and Shamira Buford were charged with the same severe offenses, including second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and felony child abuse. This additional defendant's role involved failure to intervene or report the dangerous situation, rather than direct participation in harmful acts. The case moved through the legal system, with West ultimately accepting responsibility rather than proceeding to trial. She pleaded guilty to child endangerment charges in a plea agreement that acknowledged her culpability while potentially avoiding even harsher penalties that could have resulted from trial conviction on more severe charges. At her sentencing hearing, the judge heard victim impact statements from family members devastated by the young girl's death. They described a bright, innocent life cut short by someone who should have been protecting rather than harming her. West received a life sentence for her role in the young girl's death, ensuring she will spend decades, if not the remainder of her life, in custody. The sentence reflected both the vulnerability of the victim and the egregious violation of trust inherent in a caregiver causing fatal harm to a dependent. She is currently serving her sentence in Missouri's corrections system. The Department of Corrections will determine her specific facility placement and whether she becomes eligible for any programs during her incarceration. From betrayal of trust in one context to violence driven by romantic grievances. Taylor Santiago. In January 2025, a series of shootings across state lines shocked communities as investigators discovered the attacks were connected and targeted specific individuals. The pattern suggested a calculated campaign rather than random violence. Taylor Santiago, a Missouri woman and mother, was identified as the perpetrator of these attacks. Her targets included former romantic partners, with the shootings appearing motivated by relationship grievances and perceived wrongs she believed they had committed against her. The first victim was Santiago's estranged husband, Troy Huffman, whom she lured to her home in Missouri under the pretense of seeing their child before shooting him twice. The second fatal victim was Sophia Williams, the girlfriend of Santiago's former lover, Nathan Green. Santiago shot Williams while she was lying in bed. The repetition of methodology and victim selection made clear this wasn't coincidental violence, but rather a deliberate targeting of people from Santiago's romantic history. A third victim survived a shooting attempt, but suffered serious injuries requiring hospitalization. This survivor's account helped investigators understand the pattern and build their case against Santiago, providing testimony about their shared history and the attack. What drove someone to such extreme acts of violence against multiple people? Santiago's statements to investigators revealed a worldview where she positioned herself as punishing bad guys who had wronged her. This framing suggested she viewed the violence as justified retribution rather than criminal acts, demonstrating a disturbing disconnect from legal and moral standards. The attacks spanned multiple jurisdictions, complicating the investigation as different law enforcement agencies worked to connect related incidents and coordinate their response. Evidence from crime scenes, witness statements, and ballistics analysis helped establish the links between shootings. Santiago fled across state lines after the initial attacks, prompting a multi-state manhunt. Law enforcement agencies shared information and coordinated efforts to locate and apprehend her before she could harm additional victims on what appeared to be an active hit list. Santiago was arrested in Missouri after she drove to the Aurora-Marionville Police Department to turn herself in and confess to the shootings in both states. The arrest involved coordination between Missouri and Arkansas authorities who had been tracking her movements. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide for the fatal shootings, plus attempted homicide and related weapons charges for the third attack. Additional charges were filed in Arkansas related to her activities while evading capture. On November 6, 2025, Santiago was booked into the Carroll County Detention Center in Arkansas to face charges of capital murder following her life sentence in Missouri. This legal complexity required coordination between jurisdictions about trial order and proceedings. Santiago received a life sentence plus additional years for the homicides and attempted homicide, with the exact structure determined by which jurisdiction prosecuted first and how sentences were coordinated between states. The penalties ensured she would remain incarcerated regardless of appeal outcomes. While one case involved recent violence, the final entry examines someone whose story ended naturally after years behind bars. Connie Sanders Ford. Born around 1950, Connie Sanders Ford's case represents an earlier era of Missouri crime, but shares themes common to many cases involving intimate partner violence that escalates to fatal outcomes. Her conviction stemmed from the shooting death of a former romantic partner. The relationship between Sanders Ford and her victim had ended, but she struggled to accept the conclusion of their romantic involvement. This inability to move forward manifested in behaviors that violated legal boundaries, including multiple violations of protective orders designed to keep her away from her former partner. The persistent contact, despite court orders, demonstrated Sanders Ford's refusal to respect both legal directives and her former partner's desire for separation. This pattern of behavior escalated from unwanted contact to threats and ultimately to violence. On the day of the homicide, Sanders Ford confronted her former partner in a final, fatal encounter. She shot and killed him, ending both his life and any possibility of her own freedom. The shooting appeared driven by rage over rejection and inability to accept that the relationship was permanently over. Investigation and prosecution followed, with evidence including the protective order violations establishing a pattern of escalating behavior leading to the fatal attack. Sanders Ford was convicted and received a life sentence for the homicide. She spent decades in Missouri's correctional system serving her sentence. The years in prison represented the price for allowing rejection to transform into deadly violence, with Sanders Ford growing old behind bars for choices made during a moment of rage. Connie Sanders Ford was pronounced dead at Chillicothe Correctional Center at 5 a.m. on August 26, 2024, while serving a life sentence for the first-degree murder of John Jordan. Her death ended a life sentence that had kept her incarcerated for years, with prison becoming her final residence rather than the freedom she gave up when she committed homicide. Her case was sometimes referenced as a fatal attraction scenario, comparing it to fictional depictions of obsessive relationships that turn violent. While such comparisons simplify complex human behavior, they capture the dangerous potential when romantic rejection combines with unwillingness to accept boundaries. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.